Welcome, Sam.
Thanks for having me.
So I recently read your long piece called Foundations, which you wrote with Ben Southwood and Samuel Hughes, and which is basically about the decline of Britain and how to turn things around. And before I ask you about that, I just wanted to comment that I recently moved to Australia, as many people know, and it has really struck me how much better so many things work here than they did back in London. Not that I'm down on London at all. I think it's a really beautiful city and richly historic, very green, very livable. I loved being in London, but I noticed some things absolutely breaking down, particularly during and after COVID, and that didn't go back to normal once COVID was over. So, for example, um, at my ripe old age, I still don't have a driving license because I have
Me
always
neither.
lived in
Me
very
neither. I don't know how to drive either. I'm
you're
ashamed.
much better. Because I've always lived in very walkable cities, and so I decided I would get one before coming here. And I put myself down on the waiting list because you have to first have a date for your driving test before you can start lessons. And you have to have a certain number of lessons before you can take the test. So I put myself down the waiting list for the driving test in March of 2020. And when I left and emigrated to Australia in December of 2023, I had still not got a date for my driving test.
Wow,
so,
it's astonishing.
so that's astonishing. I mean, also I trying to get a doctor's appointment. So here in Australia, you can just walk into any doctor's surgery with your Medicare insurance, which was really easy to get, and you have to supplement with a private insurance, which was also very cheap, very easy, and just mostly you can get walk-in appointments, but if not, you can just go online and click on a little appointment for whenever you like. And I actually broke my toe in 2022, my big toe, and I could not get to see anybody. I was calling every Monday at 8 a.m., which is when the surgery told me to call. And each time at 8 a.m. on the dot, I got the message saying, all our operators are full, please call again tomorrow. Um, and eventually I had a phone appointment, and they gave me an appointment to see somebody about my toe about 3 months after I had originally broken it. By that time, it had luckily healed straight, but I'm a dancer, so it could have been disastrous. That's crazy. And then finally, final example is that we're living in this very drafty vicarage built in 1870, a really beautiful big old building, and we had the heating on for only 1 hour per day because the costs were so astronomical. So we were freezing there with our electric blankets, and my housemate he was fully dressed for going outdoors in the house, wearing a puffer jacket, scarf, beanie hat, woolly gloves, indoors. So it felt, I mean, some aspects of London life felt really like they had gone into a serious decline since I was last there, and even felt quite Dickensian.
Yeah, the country does feel, in many respects, like it is in a state of disrepair. What you've described, sometimes literally and directly, is the consequence of us not building things enough. So, the drafty building that you lived in, the expensive energy costs that you were paying, and sometimes they're the indirect costs of that. The long wait for a driving test, something that my friend Ellen Pasternak has actually taken up as a kind of personal campaign to try to fix. And
Mm,
obviously that isn't caused
good.
by us not building enough stuff directly, but I think it is the consequence of us not having enough money to either direct to the service Or, more likely, I actually am a bit skeptical that the problems that the UK has in terms of public services are just a problem of not enough money. I think that they're often a problem of them being run in a very bad way and it being very difficult to reform them if you don't have money to go around. One of the big lessons, I think, of the 1980s, which I actually think were quite successful in terms of liberalizations and reforms, were that it's easier to reform things when you can grease the wheel of reform with either de facto bribes to certain groups that would otherwise oppose what you want to do, or by just setting up new things and diverting some resources, extra resources to those new things. And so the one of the real, I would say, the story of the UK over the last not just 2 or 3 years since COVID, but of the last kind of 16 years or even more since the mid 2000s, is that productivity has flatlined. And productivity is a measure of how much you're producing divided by how much time you're working. So, you can get richer, and to some extent we have gotten richer by more people joining the labor force, more people getting jobs, or by people working longer hours. But really you want to get richer by producing more stuff, by being more productive with the time you work. Just adding more hours to your workday isn't a very pleasant way of making more money. It's kind of quite an unpleasant way of making more money. And one of the reasons that we want to be rich is so that we can spend more time with our families and spend more time on vacation and things like that. And the UK really has just flatlined according to this measure of how productive we are. And had we continued growing at the rate that we were growing before, we say 2008, but I think that you could kind of take any year in the mid 2000s as your breakpoint, we would be about 25% richer in the UK, which would translate into an average family being about £8,000 a year better off. And that's obviously huge. That's a huge amount of money for families that are, at the moment earning maybe 33k. That's a really, really big amount of money to have, if we're right, been left on the table. And so this sense of malaise that you have, that I think everybody feels in the UK, and I'm in London, you're talking about London. London is by far the most prosperous place in the UK. Lots of the rest of the country is in an even worse state than London is. I think is most directly explainable by the fact that we're not able to build the things that we need. So houses are the biggest one, and I'm a huge believer in what I call the housing theory of everything, that not building enough houses causes loads of other problems. But I think also in other parts of the country, it's probably not the case that Sheffield or Birmingham need a lot more houses. Houses are already quite cheap there. But they do need better infrastructure. They do need it to be easier to drive from point to point, and for people to be able to get rail connections from point to point so that they can get better jobs. And then in other parts of the country, and both for households and especially for industry, energy prices are so high. The UK has the most expensive industrial energy prices in the world, and those energy prices are so high because we just haven't built the energy supply that we need. I think mostly nuclear. And we have decommissioned a lot of the old fossil fuel generation at the same time. For good reason, because we're worried about climate change, but we haven't built any of the things, or we haven't built nearly enough of the stuff to take up the slack. And so it's left the UK in this position where we're flatlining economically. We have very high energy costs. We have very high housing costs. And many parts of the country are totally left behind economically because they can't kind of plug into areas of higher growth. And that's the kind of core of the argument that I and Ben and Samuel have been making.
So let's start with the energy. What went wrong? So back in the 70s, wasn't the UK? I might say we a few times when I'm referring to the UK, even though I've had the most geographically confused in terms of ethnicity, nationality, and geographical location. I've had the most confusing life. But I just
that kind of makes
everywhere.
two of us. I'm an Irishman. I'm an adoptive Briton. What went wrong? Well, in up until the 60s, things were looking pretty good from an energy point of view for the UK. Historically, the rise of the British Empire was driven by energy. I don't actually believe that coal caused the Industrial Revolution, but it certainly enabled the Industrial Revolution. And, you can go even further earlier on, before the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and the UK, as it was at that time, England or kind of Britain, was producing far more energy per person than other economies in Europe, including really leading ones like France. And, we describe, based on the work by Anton Hughes, Britain, England, as the world's first energy superpower. And it was this ability to first harvest energy from wood and then harvest energy from coal and other kind of fossil fuels eventually that sort of powered Britain's rise in the 18th and 19th centuries. And then even after the Second World War, and after the Second World War is where things begin to go quite badly for the UK in many ways. But actually for a few decades, we were doing really well on nuclear power, which was the kind of energy source of the future. As late as 1965, Britain had more nuclear reactors than the rest of the world put together. So, we had 21 nuclear reactors in 1925. The US had 12, the USSR had 3. We had the first nuclear reactor in the world as well. And then a series of mistakes and a series of, I would say, fairly short-sighted decisions. Gas in the North Sea meant that gas was a much cheaper energy source. After the oil crisis in the 1970s, France made a big play and a big bet on nuclear, whereas we didn't. Nuclear sort of fell away. And then this problem of not building enough began to be compounded by fears about nuclear's safety, which led to it becoming very difficult and very expensive to build a nuclear power plant. And this effect has been around the world. It's not just the UK. Every country, really, with a few exceptions in East Asia, has made it incredibly costly, incredibly slow, and incredibly difficult to build nuclear power. So nuclear is now one of the most expensive forms of energy, even though it used to be one of the cheapest. So that's one part of the puzzle. Nuclear, which I think has a lot in its favour, has not really been something that we have taken seriously or tried to keep cheap for the last few decades. And then the other part of the puzzle is, as I mentioned, decarbonisation, which I think is important and I think is worth doing. And I think that we, as part of the world, should be interested in reducing our carbon emissions. However, the UK has made, I think, two really important errors in the way it approaches decarbonisation, or maybe even three. One is we've tried to lead the world. We've tried to be the best in the world at reducing our carbon emissions. And that's meant that we've rushed into things that other countries haven't rushed into. So, we've tried to cut our carbon emissions faster than any other developed country in the world. And in some ways, that's quite impressive. But in other ways, I think we've driven the cost of energy up very high, because the way we've done that has been, number one, to decommission a lot of coal and gas power plants way before other countries have. Germany is using brown coal, which is a really, really bad form of coal, lignite. The Germans are very much not concerned about decarbonisation, despite kind of claiming to be. The Americans are obviously using oil and gas, and to some extent coal. So we've decommissioned a lot of the cheap fossil fuel generators. And at the same time, rather than trying to use nuclear to pick up the slack in terms of electricity generation, we've turned to wind and solar, especially wind. And although I don't think wind and solar are completely terrible, and in some parts of the world, I think solar especially has a lot of promise, probably in Australia, probably in the southwest of the US, probably in southern Europe and North Africa and other sunny places. Solar is obviously just not very well suited to the UK. It's a dark country. It's the morning here when we're recording, and the sky is completely overcast. And I'm sure if I log on to the energy dashboard, which is a sort of live dashboard of where our electricity is coming from at the moment, I'm sure solar will be almost no generation at all, assuming the rest of the country is as overcast as it is here in London. And wind is really, really limited as a way of generating electricity, because it's intermittent, like solar. It only produces electricity when the wind is blowing. It's actually very expensive, because although we think of wind as being something where, okay, you build it once, you have an upfront cost, and then it's sort of free, and the same is true for solar, actually there are loads of costs associated with wind, especially that are often ignored when we talk about the cost of these generation forms. One is the cost of building the grid. And we don't need to get too deep into this, but the cost of building the electricity grid around wind and solar is very, very high because of where wind needs to go, because we have to build a lot of extra grid connections, we have to overbuild. Then there's the cost of keeping the grid in balance, because minute to minute you need the electricity system to be in balance. You can't have more electricity going in than people are using, and you can't have less electricity than people are using, and it's quite expensive to balance that when your generation is so unpredictable from minute to minute as wind is. And then from day to day and from week to week, because as we've mentioned, wind is intermittent, we need backup generation. So we need a whole other way of producing electricity, which is gas, and that costs money as well. And our argument is that these costs are usually ignored, but they're put onto the cost of bills in the UK. And our argument is that the reason that electricity costs have risen as much as they have, and just for context, electricity prices for industrial users have more than doubled in the last 20 years in inflation-adjusted terms. I mean, that's absolutely gigantic, is because we're not producing fossil fuel generation the way we used to. We're relying on very expensive wind and solar, mostly wind. I don't want to kind of blame solar too much because it's a tiny share of the UK's generation for obvious reasons. And we haven't done the things that we ought to do to make nuclear cheap. And the reason that one should be optimistic here is that while the limitations of wind power are pretty inherent to wind power, they're only really solvable if we make gigantic improvements in battery technology, which may happen eventually, but are not going to happen in the next 6 months or the next 12 months, or certainly haven't happened yet. Nuclear's costs are expensive because we have chosen for them to be expensive. We have made a decision regulatorily for nuclear to be expensive to build, and we can change that. And so, the message, or the reason that I'm optimistic about the UK, is that most of the problems we have are self-inflicted and are fixable because they're problems to do with bad regulation and bad rules and bad administration, rather than anything inherent to the UK.
You said that we, in the case of nuclear and in the case of other things, for example, high-speed rail, there are many aspects of infrastructure which are much more difficult to implement and build in the UK than in comparable European countries. And what's going on there? Is that a question of regulations? I think at one point you say that, I can't remember whether it's a stretch of motorway or rail or something, that the regulatory questions, the planning documentation for it is 30 times the length of the complete works of Shakespeare.
Yeah, this is so what you're referring to is a project that I'm a huge follower of, because it's a cool project if it happens. So it's called the Lower Thames Crossing, and this is a proposed tunnel that would go between Essex and Kent. And Essex and Kent are two of my favourite parts of the UK. I have a lot of family. I'm Irish. I've got a lot of family in Essex, and Kent is very beautiful, and it's kind of a very easy, beautiful place to visit from London. The Garden of England, some people call it. And more importantly, what this would do is link up the two biggest shipping ports in the UK. This would allow truck haulage to bring stuff from two different ports, Felixstowe and Dover. And that would be hugely beneficial to our importers and exporters. So from a trade point of view, it's a very important project. But it's also quite ambitious. It would be the furthest point of crossing of the Thames. Historically, London is where it is because it was the lowest crossing point across the Thames when the Romans arrived and they built London Bridge. Now we have the Dartford crossing, which is a bridge further down, and the Lower Thames crossing would allow crossing even further down. So it's kind of interesting from that point of view. But as you say, it's been incredibly bogged down in planning applications. The planning application so far runs to 360,000 pages. And the cost of the planning process has been £297 million. Now, to put that in context, Norway built the world's longest tunnel, actually built the longest tunnel for less than that. So we're spending more on planning than other countries are spending on actually building the project that they're trying to get built. But that's really just a one example. The high-speed rail HS2 is sort of famously, notoriously expensive in the UK. 4 times per mile the cost of a rail link in Italy that's similar, also high speed. 8 times per mile more expensive than a high-speed rail link that was recently built in France. And even within cities, so Crossrail, which is now the Elizabeth line in London, which by the way is a marvel of engineering. It's an amazing project, and it's as a sort of transit nerd, I love Crossrail. And I was talking to somebody visiting London yesterday with somebody I work with, and he was asking, like, what should I do tomorrow? I'm in London, I've got the day to myself, and I was like, oh, you should take the Elizabeth line. It's really cool. And people thought this was funny because, like, to them the Elizabeth line is just a way of getting around. To me, the Elizabeth line is a triumph of engineering, and it's a beautiful line. But unfortunately, it's also the second most expensive metro ever built in the world. A lot of the things that make it really cool at the stations are some of the most expensive metro stations ever built anywhere. And so partly the problem is regulation that makes it difficult to build things, but partly the problem is also that a lot of these projects are now being funded by central government rather than by local government or by private companies. Local government and private companies have a much stronger incentive to keep costs down than central government does. Central government is sort of a bottomless pit. It's always talking about how broke it is, but people don't lose their jobs for overspending money in central government. People get moved from one place to another. The incentives for overspending, or the incentives to keep costs down, are much weaker when it's a central government project than when it's a private company that will go bankrupt if they spend too much, or when it's a local government that, maybe they'll get kicked out by their voters, or, maybe the local government will go bust and it will be very humiliating for everybody and they will lose their jobs. And the consequence of that is that it's partly that, you buy expensive hammers, or, you get these expensive procurement things where things that should be cheap become expensive, and anybody who's been involved in a big project or witnessed a big project will know how that works, the cost inflation for even very trivial things. But it's also that they make decisions that don't reflect the true trade-offs involved. So the stations of Crossrail that I mentioned are indeed beautiful, but since they're so expensive, the overall project is much more expensive. Whereas when you look at a project like the expansion of Madrid's metro, which was done very cheaply in the 1990s and the 2000s, and then other lines added since, they did very, very pragmatic things about stations. For example, the designs of most of the stations are just the same. They're just cookie cutter designs, and they managed to keep costs down by doing that. There are lots of other decisions that they made. And ultimately, they didn't try to do best in class. They tried to do something that was good and would do the basic job of getting people around, and would do it at an affordable price. And I don't necessarily think we always want to do the cheapest sort of bog standard thing, but I think that right now we never do that, and we never make any decisions really related to keeping costs down. And so cost rise, that means that projects sometimes just get cancelled, because that's kind of the only mechanism that central government has to stop spending money, is to just say you can't do this anymore. And when we do build things, they become incredibly expensive. And because they're so expensive, we don't get to build more of them. And that's the key problem. It's not just about wasting money. It's that the projects end up becoming so expensive that we can't do, Crossrail 2 or HS3 or, the second stage of HS2. And so, it's when we talk about costs, I think it would be a mistake to think of this as primarily about a waste of money. I mean, it is a waste of money, and wasting money is really bad. This is people's actual money that they've worked hard for, and we're taking. But if we were taking that money and spending it in a cost-efficient way on brilliant new railway lines or brilliant new roads and things like that, then I think that would be a much more reasonable ask to make of people. But we're both taking the money and spending it very irresponsibly, and because of that, we're not able to build more things, and so we end up with too little infrastructure, and that is a very, very big problem, especially when you are in a part of the country. London has amazing infrastructure, to be fair to it. London, has world-class railways, metro line. The London Underground, in many ways, is one of the best metro lines in the world. It's very old, so it's a bit, dirtier and more cramped than more new metro lines, especially in East Asia. But it's very extensive. It carries huge numbers of people every day. And what it does is allow people from, places like Essex to get jobs on the other side of the city. And so it expands the labour market and expands the pool of jobs people can take. And that means people can get better jobs, they can improve their skills, they can earn more, and the overall economy can become more productive. And when you look at other parts of the country like Birmingham, Birmingham is really, in most ways, the UK's second city, but it has far worse infrastructure than London does. And so you end up with places that are actually, as the crow flies, much closer to the centre of Birmingham than parts of London where people would commute from. In Birmingham, those don't really have reliable connections. So there aren't really reliable ways of people getting from point A to B because of congestion, because there aren't railway links, whatever it might be. And so, while infrastructure for London is really nice, and, I think London should get bigger, and I think infrastructure would make it better, for places like Birmingham, for places around kind of Sheffield, Manchester, Liverpool, and so on, where they have far worse transit links, you actually get much less economic development and much less kind of labour market sophistication because people are trapped in the places that they live, and they can't commute easily to better jobs in other parts of the kind of urban area. So infrastructure is great for London, but infrastructure is vital for other parts of the UK.
We've also just done a best-in-class, beautifully designed metro here in Sydney, which I'm sure was immensely expensive. And although Sydney has some very beautiful forms of public transport, like the ferries, which
Yeah.
everyone adores, and also has the advantage of it being extremely easy to get to the airport by public transport, very easy and fast. But nevertheless, it's not a terribly well-connected city, and we spent a lot of money putting swanky new metro stations where we already have train stops, actually.
Interesting. It's and it's
I
true that
love the
these are.
metro. It's beautiful, but I'm also mindful of the same kind of trade-offs that you're talking about there.
I think it's yeah, and I think it is a trade-off question, as you say. This isn't to say that we should never build anything beautifully. I'm a big believer in, as a recent guest of yours was talking about, I'm a big believer in beauty. I think that public beauty is very important. I want to live in a beautiful place, but I also want us to be aware of trade-offs. And would I rather Crossrail, the Elizabeth line, had stations that were still beautiful, but beautiful for a quarter of the price, rather than the most incredibly avant-garde, most incredibly amazingly designed kind of architectural marvels that we have. I think I'd probably prefer the slightly cheaper one, and I'd like to have a second Crossrail with still beautiful, but and actually we probably don't need to get into this here, but it just isn't the case that spending more money gets you the most amount of beauty. It can also mean that you're just spending money on what an architect considers to be beautiful, or what an architect considers to be challenging or kind of progressive from an architectural point of view, but to a normal person is actually kind of neither here nor there. And the Madrid Metro, I'm not going to claim that the Madrid metro stations are beautiful. They're like pretty utilitarian, but that they're not bad. And they make decisions around using tiles and things like that actually give them that they feel quite good to be in. So it isn't just a pure trade-off between beauty and money. And a lot of the beauty question actually relates to housing, where I've spent more than a decade talking about the need for more housing. And one of the, I think, really important factors in both what we should be building and how we should be getting it built is beauty. And in recognizing that people want to live in a beautiful area, that people are very, I think, kind of reasonably averse to the idea of tower blocks going around them, but are much more accepting of what friends of mine call gentle density, where you build up to, say, 6 or 7 stories, you build townhouses, you aim for a sort of mid-rise type building, and you do it in styles that are, in the UK, quite historic. So Georgian styles or Victorian or Edwardian styles that are very beautiful, that most of the most popular parts of London are built in these styles. And they also happen to be very dense. That's what's so cool about them, because it's a mistake to think that density equates to tower blocks. You can get a lot of people in a much more livable way with these kind of mid-rise type developments. And I think that getting there. That when when we've talked about energy, we've talked about infrastructure. When we talk about housing, I think housing is overwhelmingly an incentives problem, where there are a lot of people who would like new housing to be built because it costs so much and because the shortage of housing stops them from getting better jobs. And there are also a lot of people on the other side who want to protect the nature of their area and want their area to be beautiful and livable, and they want it to be like what they expected when they bought their home. And I disagree with the formulation that some pro-housing people have, that this is a kind of an irreconcilable problem and that we have to just override the latter group in order to satisfy the former group. I actually think we can make these decisions win-win, and we can make it so that new housing enhances the quality of an area if we build it beautifully and if we build it in sympathetic styles that people actually want. And so, when we talk about beauty, it sounds sometimes quite abstract, but when we think about, I'd like to live in an area that looks nice, I'd like to live in an area that feels historic, or that is historic or built in historic ways, if we could offer that as, yes, we are going to build more housing in your area, and you get to have a say in that. And the reason that we think you want to say yes is that we're going to make your area more beautiful and more livable, and that we'll bring more services to your area. That's, in my opinion, how we might be able to unpick what seems like an irreconcilable tension and make housing something that people actually say yes to, rather than something that we have to override people's opposition to.
I was quite interested reading the housing theory of everything, that you talk about. One area of housing you talk about is being close to good jobs, being able to commute to jobs. And you even say that jobs that are ideas based, for those jobs, it's especially important to be around physically close to other creative people. And that seems quite counterintuitive to me, because I would have thought that many of those jobs could now be done as work from home. And I do one of those jobs, and I will probably long term or medium term have to move out of Sydney, actually, because it's too expensive. And even though our office is here, I'm still only going in once a week, because I don't live close to the office, which would also be too expensive. And do you think that the increase in people working from home has changed that calculus at all, or do you still think it's important that people are close to their jobs, or how much do you think jobs are moving to becoming more virtual or more completely virtual?
I think that there's probably based on the research that I've read and based on the what companies that are trying to sort of grapple with both the opportunities that remote work create and also the challenges. What I think that we'll probably end up with a sort of hybrid system where most people are required or expected to come into the office for a few days a week, or for the equivalent to a few days a week, and also they are allowed to work from home sometimes as well. So, remote work in many ways is an amazing thing, because it doesn't just allow people to not go into the office. It allows people to work across time zones and continents. I manage a team of about 7 people, and I manage people in California, New York. I work very closely with somebody who's in the Netherlands, and this just wouldn't have been possible 10 years ago or more than 10 years ago. And that's miraculous. I'm also very pleased that when I need to do kind of heads down work, if I just want to edit a piece or just want to write or something, I find that kind of easier to do in my home office than at work. But I think there is a lot of work, especially quite intangible work, that is much easier to do when you are face to face with somebody. I think there's a lot of latency problem when it comes to, there's a delay between sending information and receiving information when you have to do it remotely. And kind of in-person conversation has the lowest latency of any kind of way of communicating, I think. And also there are lots of other cues like body language, tone of voice, things like that, that don't really come across that easily on a Zoom call, but do in person. And, this isn't just my instinct. This is what most major employers, especially kind of tech companies, which I would characterize as being a very kind of knowledge-based type type of work, they have decided that they want people to come into the office. They are very, very much kind of grappling with the fact that people often don't want to come into the office for the reasons you mentioned. The commute takes a long time. It's a pain in the ass. When I work from home, I get to see my baby son as soon as I finish work. If I work in the office, it takes me 45 minutes or half an hour to get home, and I miss a lot of really valuable time with him, which I hate. Um, so I think a lot of companies have to grapple with this, but we just look at the evidence of what kinds of companies seem to be the most keen to not just have their people come into the office, but co-locate with other companies like them. And it's overwhelmingly kind of software type companies. It's companies like advertising type sector companies, legal companies, basically jobs where the main resource is people and the main kind of currency is ideas. They just seem to really like the kind of pooling effect of having people nearby each other. So it's possible that remote work becomes, clearly the technology is going to get better and better. It's possible that we get to a point where the, VR or whatever ends up being so good that it's almost identical to being with somebody in real life when you speak to them virtually. In that case, who knows? All bets are off. But I think even then, there is a really valuable non-work setting for a lot of people when they get to meet people outside their jobs, or meet people in the pub and stuff like that. And you find that a lot of unconventional breakthroughs that combine people's insights from different areas seem to especially benefit from being in person. So famously, both Bell Labs and which is a big research lab that in the kind of 50s and 60s developed a lot of the technologies like Ethernet and Wi-Fi and things like that we use today, and the graphical user interface that most computers are built on. Bell Labs was designed for people from different departments to bump into each other and hopefully have a conversation and find, you're working on graphics, I'm working on sensory inputs. Maybe we could come up with the idea of a mouse together or something. Pixar did the same thing. Pixar was built to kind of cram people from different departments to find each other. I recently went to I don't want to mangle what they do, a biotech company, let's just say, in the UK, in London, that does a lot of work around tissue regeneration, human tissue regeneration. And they use a combination of wet lab research with kind of medical researchers and machine learning. And they insist on having their machine learning engineers and their biologists and microbiologists and medical technologists in the same office together, because they want them to speak to each other. They want them to talk. And they just want to minimize the frictions to having a conversation. And I think that's really interesting. And that's why I am, although, I'm pretty pleased that remote work is possible, I am not convinced that remote work is going to remove the value to sort of in-person exchange. And one of the big questions that someone like me has to answer is, why is it that the problem of housing shortages seems to be getting so much worse in the last 10, 20 years? It's partly that cities are running up to their kind of natural limits, but I think it's also partly that the global economy is shifting towards a much more intangible based model of ideas than sort of physical, tangible capital. And that lends itself very much to cities and people pooling into a handful of big cities where, it's like London or like Sydney or Melbourne or like San Francisco, obviously, or New York, where you just have this huge pool of people working with each other, having ideas with each other, and kind of jumping from company to company. And I think that this is actually a genuinely recent phenomenon in the last 20 to 30 years. And I think this is one of the big driving forces behind the huge housing shortages that we're seeing, because people increasingly want to move to places like London and New York and Sydney and San Francisco, and are running up against shortages that we need to address.
Yeah. Well, I have this in my personal life as well, which is that I am looking for what is the largest Australian city where I can, and the most pleasant city where I can afford to buy a one-bedroom flat, and therefore be in a walkable place with a good social life, and where I can pursue my hobbies like dancing, and yet be able to buy a place. And that's definitely not possible in Sydney.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking medium term of moving to Brisbane. But Brisbane is also getting very pricey.
This is,
um,
I mean, this is a story. This is a story, especially in the English-speaking world, but across the entire developed world. And I think you've hit the nail on the head about you don't just want a place to live. You want a place to that you can actually live your life. You don't just need a roof over your head. You need to be able to meet people who are like you, who have similar interests to you. You need to be able to do your hobbies. You want to be able to walk outside your front door. And I'm not anti-suburbia, but I think many people crave, as I do, activity and life, and they love what cities or sort of, let's just, not necessarily cities, towns and cities can offer them. And that to me is a very strong sign that while we should be very, I think, comfortable with building new suburbs, more kind of single family units, we should also be, I think we are underbuilding, and a lot of the development stories, a lot of the debate around what we should be building neglects how valuable gentle density can be, and that some of the most beautiful and livable parts of the world are the ones that aren't suburbia. They are the kind of you're not talking about the sort of central business district type super tall high rises, talking about the 6-story type things, and that makes me optimistic, because I think people are actually okay with that kind of thing being built around them, provided it enhances the quality of their area, and doesn't just add congestion, doesn't just add crime, doesn't just add antisocial behavior, and I think we can do that. I think we can offer that to them.
so the lowering of living standards and productivity in the UK relative to the rest of the Anglophone world, relative also to other European countries, what went wrong? When did it go wrong? And what can we do to fix it?
In the UK, where we point the blame is the post-war government in the UK, probably the most revolutionary government the UK has ever had, the Attlee government, which, not out of any malintent, not because they were bad people, they made a mistake in terms of what they thought was the best way to run a country or an economy, and they nationalized very large parts of the economy. We think of things like the utilities, the railways, but they actually also nationalized things like road haulage. They combined what was an industry of effectively kind of sole traders, a person who just owned a truck, or maybe a small business of a few people who kind of pooled a few trucks. They combined the road haulage industry into a single industry. They nationalized the way land use can be determined, and actually, while Thatcher, I think, while Thatcher's legacy is mixed, I think overall it was pretty good. And we have some, I think, quite striking evidence that the UK actually grew relative to other countries very, very impressively from the early 1980s. And while Thatcher reversed a lot of what that Attlee government did around privatizing telecoms, privatizing the railways, actually that was major, but same extended period of rule. What she and what her successors never did was liberalize the land and liberalize the way land can be built on. And a lot of the problems we talk about are downstream of that. The UK basically began to stagnate relative to other major economies from this period, having actually grown very impressively in the 1930s, and having had a fairly mixed 20s, but prior to the First World War been obviously the most productive country in Europe and almost the most productive country in the world. The US was doing very well then as well, but the UK was certainly keeping pace. What was really, really, really disastrous for the UK was this period of nationalizations, followed by a consensus that this was the right thing to do, and that this kind of management of the economy from the centre was the right thing to do, compounded by mistakes around energy and abandoning nuclear and things like that. And, one of the countries that we point to that might surprise people as a country that didn't make those mistakes was France. And, we think of France as a very heavily regulated country. The taxes are very high there. It's so heavily regulated. They have
The
rules
crazy unions.
yeah, they have unions that protest in very violent ways, very 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 at least very destructive. Maybe not violent against humans, but against property. We have a picture of a little cart that at least one union has developed to allow them to grill sausages while they're marching, and the cart kind of rolls along tram lines. It's funny, but by most standards that most people would judge an economy, France is getting everything wrong. And yet France is quite a rich country. It's at least as rich as the UK by any reasonable standard. And so what does France do that allows it to be rich? And our argument is that they actually get the basics really, really right. So it's much easier to build houses in France. There are 37 million homes in France compared to 30 million in the UK with about the same size populations. France has about double the motorway network that we do, and most of the motorway network is tolled, so it's self-sustaining in terms of how they pay for it. France obviously has a very impressive high-speed rail network, and as I mentioned earlier, France built a lot of nuclear in the 70s and 80s that has allowed it to both decarbonize way ahead of everybody else. That wasn't their intention, but kind of accidentally they ended up decarbonizing way before the rest of the world, and also to produce large amounts of electricity at reasonably low prices. And they have their problems. They in particular they now suffer from the same problems in terms of nuclear costs that the rest of the world does. They have made it just as difficult to build new nuclear as we have, but they are kind of in a much better place because they made better decisions than we did. And our argument, or my claim, is that this allows France to afford the kind of big welfare state, the low retirement age, the wildly overbearing unions, I would say, and the very, very high rates of tax that otherwise would ruin an economy.
And the month of August off.
And the month of August off, absolutely, absolutely. And now that is a decision that I personally would not make. I like time off work, but I think that the French model that is not how I would spend the wealth that France has. But that's a decision that country can make. They have the luxury of saying, you know what, we would rather have a very long holiday. We'd rather shut down the country in August than make more money and have more money to spend on whatever, cars or holidays or whatever it might be, meals out. That's fine. That's a decision. That's a great decision to be able to make. And our argument is that if you get those basics right, the way France has and the way the UK could, then we would be able to make those decisions for ourselves, rather than being in the situation now where we have neither long holidays, nor lots of money, nor functional public services and infrastructure.
Mm-hmm. So I read your piece on the Greater London Project, which is an absolutely lovely project, and I've been sending it to friends who are in London and telling them to sign up. And you make some very specific suggestions there for things you would do to improve London. But I'm just going to ask you if you have some specifics for what you would do to improve Britain. Give me some little specific projects that if you were in charge, you would set about encouraging some specific changes you'd make.
Okay, I'll give you three. One thing I would do is what's called street votes, where I would allow streets, the residents of streets, to vote on their own upzoning and to say, the street I live on, it goes up to about 4 stories, 3 stories, and the residents of my street should be able to say, we want to unilaterally upzone to 6 or 7 stories. Not much taller than that, because once you get above 6 or 7 stories, that becomes a problem for other streets, and you don't want to do that. And the reason that I want to do that is that I think a lot of places might actually surprise us and say, we would like more gentle density. We would like our suburban street to be more like a street of townhouses and low-rise apartment blocks, provided it's done in a beautiful way. So I think that's one thing. I actually think that could be a really effective bottom-up way of getting more housing built. that there's good evidence from around the world, Israel, South Korea, Japan, that when you give places this sort of power, they actually use it and they actually do upzone. That's one. That's one way I would get more housing. Number two, I would make it a lot easier for private companies and local councils to build, local authorities to build new roads and railways, and provided they're self-financing. I would allow Parliament to give protection to those projects. So Parliament it should be quite easy for central government to say, okay, Birmingham, you want to build a metro line. Okay, we're going to consider the project, and we're going to give you a final decision, and we're going to pass a law that protects this project from all the annoying judicial reviews and all the challenges that currently bog down these projects. And I think that would allow us to get much more infrastructure built, and it could be self-financing so that it would be paid for by the users of the infrastructure, which would mean that we could get a lot of it and there wouldn't be a huge extra taxpayer burden. And then the third thing I would do would be around nuclear. The hard thing would be to try to unpick all of the regulations and all of the bad decisions we've made about how expensive it is to build. What I would do that's easy would be to phone up the South Korean nuclear authority, KEPCO.
I was going to say that.
And KEPCO is
come to Australia as well.
Is it? Well, I'm very interested to see how this project goes, because South Korea is one of the only developed countries that is still building nuclear quite cheaply. They're building it for about a quarter of the price that we are per unit of energy generation, and they are also, as you mentioned, building projects overseas. So they've done some in the United Arab Emirates. They're doing some in the Czech Republic. I didn't know they were doing Australia, but that's very...
they're not.
Oh,
they need to.
I see. Yeah, I see. And
whilst you're on the phone to them, could you ask them to?
I will. Yeah, I will. Well, and actually, this would make my plan even easier, because I would order a lot of them. I would, one of the things we're doing at the moment is we build each project one at a time. We have no pipeline. We don't order a fleet of nuclear reactors. We just build one reactor, and then we say, okay, great. And then 3 years later, we say, oh, you know what? We should build another nuclear reactor. I would say we need to get the UK to be an energy abundant country, clean energy, constant energy, and abundant energy. And I would say, okay, KEPCO, South Korean nuclear, South Korean energy company, what can you do for us? If we wanted to build not just 5 reactors, but 20 reactors or 25 reactors, if we wanted to double our electricity output so that we were approaching the amount of electricity that's produced in actually South Korea or in the United States, what would that cost us over this period of time? And I believe and expect we could actually end up getting a lot of energy online very, very much more cheaply than the energy we're building at the moment, or that we would be building if we made it possible. And we would be able to do it in a way that was not undermining our need to decarbonize. So those are my 3 things. Call KEPCO, make it easier to build privately and build by local authorities, and give streets and blocks of housing much more control over whether they want to upzone or not. And I think that would certainly not solve the problem, but I think it would definitely begin to solve the problem. And, the reason that I actually think that that's exactly the right way to think about these problems. I'm kind of anti-revolutionary in lots of ways. I sort of don't believe in throwing out the whole system and kind of trying to build a new one, because it almost always goes wrong, as we learned in the 1940s. I think that small marginal incremental improvements are almost always the way. Even if you were hoping for a big outcome, the small marginal incremental tweaks are almost always the way to get things done. And I am super optimistic for the UK. The thing that I always say is Britain gets all of the hard things right and all of the easy things wrong. You talked about at the beginning, London, Britain is a wonderful place. It has incredible history. It's a beautiful country. The people here, I think, are some of the best people in the world. They love debate. They love argument. They're fascinated by ideas. They respect the rule of law. This is a country. They're incredibly tolerant. I think that British tolerance is really underrated by people in Britain. We kind of take it for granted. We're like fish swimming in the sea who don't realize we're wet. But the things like that, no other country that doesn't have those things can make them happen overnight, if it can make them happen at all. The things we're bad at are just building things, just making it easy to build a railway line if you want to build a railway line, or build a nuclear power plant if you want to build a nuclear power plant. That is so easy to fix compared to the things that we don't need to fix, that I feel very, very optimistic for the UK, and I think we will fix these things. I've been so taken aback by the response to this essay. Hundreds of thousands of people have read it, most of them in the UK, and dozens of people have reached out to me to ask how they can help and what they can do to fix this. And that makes me feel like we have the people, we have the interest, and we have, I think, the opportunity. So maybe in 10 years' time, we'll do another follow-up episode, and we'll be able to talk about all the things that we managed to fix and all the things that went right for Britain.
I have a few questions if you still have a little bit of time for you.
As much time, I have all the time in the world.
Oh, okay, great. I won't take that much more time because time is money in terms of paying for editing, because I don't edit myself. But let's see. First of all, I had a question which was, so I recently read Michael Muthukrishna's book, The Theory of Everyone. And actually, I met him here in Sydney. I went to his talk here, and he is very keen on the idea of abolishing income taxes and replacing them with a flat land tax. What do you think about that idea? That seems to mesh very nicely with your idea of the theory of housing being the explanation for everything.
So I am not as sold. By the way, I love Michael. I think he's a great guy. I am not personally sold on the idea of replacing all other taxes with a land value tax. I think that a land tax, or some combination of a land tax and a property tax, can be quite useful in some ways. One is that it's fairly efficient. You can't, unlike most taxes, which create problems because people change their behavior to avoid the tax. The problem with income tax is that people actually work less, or choose less highly paid career paths because income tax can be so high. It can make it not worth their while. We don't want that. A land value tax, there isn't really that much you can do to avoid a land value tax. I actually think a property tax, although I used to think property taxes were just a terrible idea because, the response to a property tax is that you invest in property less and you build less. The good thing about property taxes, when they're collected locally, is that they give local people another reason to want something to be built near them. Historically, local authorities in Britain, and this is true in much of the US as well, they would retain a lot of the property taxes paid by new things. So, okay, I don't want a new prison being built near me, but actually, if the prison is paying high property taxes to my local council, and that local council can then spend that on better roads or better childcare provision or whatever, that's okay. Maybe I'll take the prison. Maybe I'll accept the prison. So I'm a fan of property taxes for that reason. I'm a fan of land value taxes to some extent because they can be efficient, but I don't think you can actually raise that much from land value taxes without it becoming effectively a giant windfall tax on current landowners. And most current landowners are not like the Duke of Westminster, who effectively people who own their land because an ancestor of theirs killed somebody and took the land from them. Most people who own land are just normal people who saved up and bought their house and bought their land. And, that's basically their life savings. And a really high land value tax effectively just takes away all of the value of their land. And, look, that's all taxes do that to some extent. So I don't think that's a knockdown argument against the taxes per se, but I do think it's a pretty good argument against just like taking the whole value. I think there are also actually disincentives that people who like land value taxes disagree with, and maybe it's a bit too complicated to get into here, but land value taxes I think actually do create a problem of penalizing land assembly. So when you buy a lot of different plots that had been previously owned by different owners and you join them together as a single plot, I think land assembly is a really good thing because it gets you things like arcades, and it allows you to have areas that are sort of built in a single cohesive way. And I think land value taxes deter that. Personally, when it comes to tax, I think that the goal should be to move taxation to consumption. So I think that when we tax anything really, almost anything. What we're really taxing is final consumption, but just in a roundabout way. So VAT or general services tax, or goods and services tax, sorry, those are effectively consumption taxes. They're saying, take all the money you want, and then right at the end, when you actually use the money to make yourself happy, we're going to tax you right there. I actually think that's a much cleaner way of taxing people than you invested your money in this company, we're going to tax you there, and you traded some stocks, well, we're going to tax you there. Oh, you worked for a company for a few more hours, we're going to tax you there. Those are all, in my opinion, different ways of taxing consumption. They're just messy ways that penalize people for doing certain things, but not people for doing other things. The only problem with consumption tax, I think, is that it hits people. Most people, including myself, would like to tax wealthy people in a higher proportion of their income than we tax people on lower incomes. I think you can get around that through various mechanisms. You can either do stuff like giving people cash. You can do stuff like taxing people at the point where they receive the money, but not when they receive the money from certain things. They're basically ways of getting around that problem that allow you to have a progressive consumption tax, but still focus the tax on consumption, on the sort of the final use of the money.
Okay, a couple more questions for you. Abhishek Saha, this is from Twitter, he asks, I'm curious if your guest has any thoughts on whether the rise of the bureaucratic class is holding Britain back, as claimed in a recent Conservative pamphlet. More generally, any thoughts on how reform of the labour market would help with growth?
So this is referring to a quite surprisingly dense pamphlet released by one of the Conservative Party leadership candidates, Kemi Badenoch. At the time of recording, she is one of the candidates. She may or may not have won by the time many people are listening to this. And this claims that a lot of the underlying demand for regulation and what you might call safetyism, the kind of aversion to risk, is coming from a class of people who are educated at university, who have jobs that are kind of not super productive, but kind of exist because of regulation. And the pamphlet sort of highlights human resources as an example of this, which I'm not entirely sure about. On the specific highlighting of human resources, in my experience, human resources kind of exist to help a company navigate regulation rather than to enforce. They're not there to kind of wag their fingers at people and say, oh, aren't you very bad? Tut. They're saying, this is illegal. They're more like kind of lawyers in some ways who are sort of advising you on, like, given the rules, this is what you need to do. Anyway, that's a sort of an aside. I think there is something to this theory, and I think it's a useful way of thinking about some of these issues. It's ultimately, I think, slightly too Marxist in the sense that it assumes that people derive their beliefs from their material interests. And I think that that's generally not the case. I think often people do not derive their beliefs from what is in their interests materially. They derive their beliefs from what they genuinely believe to be good, or what their peers have, or what they've sort of through their lives sort of encountered and experienced to be good. And while I appreciate Marxist analysis, again, I'm not a Marxist, but I think it's really useful to be able to say, like, what would the world be like, or like, what would this problem look like if everybody was driven by their material interests? In the same way with economics, when we, which Marxism is not, but kind of real economics uses a construct called Homo economicus, where we sort of imagine that everybody's rational, and then we say, okay, if everybody was rational, would they behave in this way? And is this theory consistent with a world where everybody was rational? We don't actually believe that everybody is rational. We don't actually believe that everybody's always making kind of welfare maximizing rational decisions at all times. But it's a useful thought experiment. It's a useful kind of limit case for theories about the world. And I think this is similar. I don't actually think it describes the world very accurately, that people are driven by their material interests. Thus, they want more regulation because regulation sort of gives them a job. And, they have been given an education and a set of skills that can only really exist in a world of high regulation. I don't really believe that, but I think it's kind of a useful, okay, that's an interesting limit case of thinking about both what we might want to change and how we might want to change people's incentives so that they don't demand more and more regulation. So I think it's an interesting and somewhat useful theory, but I think it probably doesn't explain more than a fraction of the world or the UK as it is today. In terms of labour market regulation, it's more, for the UK, it's more about not doing things that we're planning on doing. We're planning on making it much harder to fire people. We're planning on moving to a much more kind of French way of doing labour market regulation. The UK has at the moment a fairly flexible labour market. We're moving to one like France, and if I'm right, that France can afford to have that kind of regulation because it gets the things right that we get wrong, then that's going to be very costly for us.
I was quite interested in what you said about higher education and foundations. You said simply, we don't know why we need, what we want from higher education, what we should be doing with higher education, or who should pay for it. And I don't know whether you want to go into that at all.
Yeah.
You just I think that was the only sentence mentioning it, and I was quite intrigued as to whether you feel there is an answer to those whether you have an answer to those questions in mind.
My answer, and I'm not going to claim to be an expert here, and I don't want to. I'm always a bit reluctant to give a strong answer on something like this, where I might change my mind in the future. But my view is basically that most people who go into university, almost all of them, are going in on the hopes that it will give them better job prospects in their lives. Almost every individual, they're taking on large amounts of debt because they think that it will be worth it for them, that will give them a better lifetime in terms of both the quality and the income that they make from their job. And I think that in many occasions, that is not what they are going to actually get. So that's one thing. I think there's a lot of effectively mis-selling or misjudgment of the value of higher education. And this is just empirically correct, that a lot of people do not get very much value out of their degrees. They even sometimes get no value or zero value. So that's one thing. So I think that implies that a lot of people, by their own accounts, are going to university who would prefer not to if they had a better understanding of what the university education they're getting would set them up with. The other kind of point is that a lot of people who are not in that position believe that there is a social benefit to people going to university, and so we should be encouraging people to go to university, and that because there's a social benefit to that. Now, number one, if you think that, then it shouldn't be the actual students taking on the debt, or there should be a subsidy to reflect the social benefit of university education. Number two, I actually don't agree that there is a huge social benefit. In fact, I think there may be a big social disbenefit to a lot of people going to university. I don't think that university education is very good in lots of cases. I think that it often gives people quite a biased education and quite a biased view of the world. And I think it skews people politically in a way that is kind of destructive. I think that it is not a coincidence that when people have a university degree, they tend to have much more left-wing views. They tend to have a much stronger set of opinions about politics than similar people who have not gone through university. And while I don't think that we should be doing anything to deter people from having those views, I don't think that there is a strong case to subsidize people to have those views. And I think it's a mistake if we are subsidizing people to have those views. Now, in practice, we do actually subsidize people to a very large extent to go to university. I think the most important step would be to not subsidize people to go to university, plus to give them information, lots of information about going into universities with their eyes open, about the differences between different universities, about the differences between different university courses, and also to make sure that where there are sort of implicit subsidies, like we're giving people generous loans, that those are available to other paths. So I think that we should be not subsidizing loans nearly as much as we do, and we should also make those loans available if you want to learn a trade, or you want to, hey, I think even go traveling or start a business or whatever, or do a coding course. I think that kind of step would make it easier for people to take a neutral decision about their future, to not be sort of nudged into one particular path, and also to just, I think, generally say universities are probably too large. We probably are encouraging people to go to university when it is harmful to them to go to university, and I think the social consequences of that are pretty bad and tend to steer society in a bad direction.
And one more question also, and this is from my best friend, Maya. She asks, ask him if it's possible, and if so, how, to reduce the size and power of a dysfunctional bureaucracy that prevents innovation and productivity, hopefully without the need for societal collapse and rebuilding from the ground up.
Yes, I agree. That should be our first priority. Should be definitely we do not want societal collapse. And what I think Maya is sort of referring to there is this idea that states become kind of inevitably bureaucratic and sclerotic. And what companies do as well, by the way, almost all companies die. And almost all companies don't just fix themselves and say, oh, we became very bureaucratic and wasteful, we're now going to become good. They just become bankrupt. And luckily, when a company goes bankrupt, we have dealt with that very, very well as a society, and it's not a big deal when a company goes bankrupt for the most part. When a state collapses, that's like civil war. That is absolutely terrible. You can lead to things that are much worse following on. But I am very, very interested in what you might call kind of mini bankruptcies within states, where rather than the state itself failing, we allow institutions within the state to fail and create new ones instead. And this is something that I think you get occasional glimpses into from successful reforms, where usually successful reforms don't actually improve an existing regulation or improve an existing agency. They usually create a new one, and they usually just divert everything that was covered by the old agency or the old regulation into a new one. So, I think the most salient example in the UK is the Vaccines Task Force, which allowed us to procure vaccines way ahead of Europe, and really gave us many more months of freedom in 2021, and also far fewer deaths than we would have had from COVID, because we did the vaccines in the right way. And what was interesting about that was that we didn't get the existing agencies, which were crap, to be honest, to do this. We didn't opt into the European system. We set up a new agency, a small task force led by an outsider, and we said, okay, you are tasked with this. Do what you can to get us the vaccines that we need. And I think that when we look at successful reforms in housing, when we look at successful reforms in even childcare and things like that, again and again and again, we see that they don't actually unpick existing regulations. They just create new vehicles, new regulatory structures that everything just gets moved into. And so when I think about something like science funding, where I think we should spend quite a bit of money on funding scientific research in the developed world, but currently the way we spend that money is terrible. It's very wasteful. It wastes scientists' time. It goes towards projects that are unambitious. It's crap. I think that rather than trying to fix the agencies that spend that money and fix the things that are happening right now, my goal is to, or my belief is that we'll probably end up fixing this by creating new agencies, diverting funds to these new agencies, and then just letting the old ones fail and die. And that goes back to this point that I made right at the very beginning of the call about when we have more money to go round, it is much easier to fix things and to reform things, because we could fund parallel agencies while we're doing the transition from one to the other, and then wind down the old agency if we had more money to go around. And that would then, I think, enable this sort of process of effectively bankruptcy. Bankruptcy, you can't really have profit without bankruptcy. You can't really have heaven without hell. You can't really, I think, have successful state reform without old agencies being wound down and destroyed. That's a slightly violent metaphor, but slightly violent choice of words. But I think that is something that is so interesting, so fascinating. I don't consider myself to be an expert in it, but I believe that as we try to learn more about improving states and state effectiveness, this will be an area that we, the world and people who are listening to this podcast, hopefully learn more about and explore more about, and kind of maybe we can figure out how to do this.
Yeah, I'm going to quote you here. I think this came from, I think this is from the Foundation's document, which I'll put into the show notes, obviously. Economic failure saps confidence. It begets dependency, resentment, defeatism, division, and bitterness. It turns win-win relationships into zero-sum ones, where someone else must fail for you to succeed. Economic reform is not only the key to prosperity, it is the key to preserving and amplifying what is valuable about our society itself. So I thought that was a very powerful statement. And I want to ask you about one more thing, which is we began, among other things, by talking about problems with the NHS, particularly post-COVID, when the NHS moved over largely to a phone-only appointment system, which seems to me like a crazy way to do medicine. Do you have any thoughts about how could we move towards a system that remains equitable, but just works better? Given that in medicine, one of the issues, is that in medicine, of course, you're not. It's not the same as placing a VAT on a good that you're choosing to buy, because, of course, you're not choosing to be ill and you're not choosing to have a more serious or a less serious illness. So it's not a consumer good in the same way as other consumer goods. But nevertheless, it costs money and has trade-offs.
So my basic belief is that the systems that work best around the world for healthcare are the ones where the state pays but does not provide. I think that when you look at Europe and you look at Singapore, which there are mixed approaches in Europe, but France, the Netherlands have systems where you have insurance provided by the state, and your costs will be covered for the most part by the state, but the provision is being done by a combination of the charitable sector and the private sector. I think that works fairly well. The UK model is where you actually have a state-run company providing everything. It's tremendously ineffective, tremendously inefficient. It's bad for everybody. It's terrible for staff. It's terrible for patients. It's expensive. It doesn't deliver very good outcomes. I don't support the US system because the US system leads to horrible costs for people. It tends to actually shield people who can't afford to pay from those costs, but not in a way that is, I think, sustainable, sustainable is it's not a good word to use, not in a way that is any rational human being would say, it's good that you get a $200,000 bill for your cancer treatment, and don't worry, you won't actually have to pay it. You'll just have to declare medical bankruptcy or something. That is obviously not a good outcome. There is one thing, however, in favor of the US system that is not a reason to have it, but is a reason to kind of be to not be incredibly sad that it exists, because huge amounts of the world's medical innovation happens in America because so much money is spent on medicine over there, and most of the rest of the world is free riding effectively on American healthcare spending. And so while I would never want to live in that system, I do actually enjoy some of the benefits of it because I get to use some of the treatments that then are developed over there. But I don't want to adopt that. I think that would be a mistake. The real challenge for the NHS, and the reason I kind of sighed out of ignorance really, is how do you get from where the UK is now to a Dutch type system where you have the state paying but not the state providing? I think it's really hard. I think the politics of it are incredibly tricky, and I don't hold out a lot of hope for that kind of reform happening. I just think it's very, very difficult to imagine because the NHS is so popular here. People consider it to be it's almost the way people think about the army in the US, or people think about national religions in some countries and historically have thought about them. So it makes it really tricky.
Yeah, it is 100% a religion.
It's sad because, it treats people very badly and it treats staff very badly. Nobody wins from the current system. And and yet people have a real attachment to the idea of everybody being in it together. And I think that maybe people will eventually change their minds, but I think it will probably have to get worse before it gets better, because everybody's first response is we need to spend more money on the NHS, and we've massively increased NHS funding in the last few years, and it's basically led to no improvement. In some cases, the system is worse, and I used to be very blasé about the NHS because I was a healthy young man. As I get a bit older, I'm still reasonably healthy, thankfully, but I am beginning to experience the healthcare system more, having had a baby, having had older relatives who need healthcare, and the more I experience it, the more I think that it is very, very much in need of reform, in a way that produces significantly better outcomes and puts people on the hook for the mistakes and for the bad outcomes that are produced by it.
What makes you most optimistic about the future of the UK?
I think it's the fact that the problems that we identify are so easy to fix. And I also think it's the fact that while lots of other countries have, I think, experienced very, very worrying shifts on both sides in sort of how people think about politics. It's not really the case that the UK has. The UK, I think, is a very tolerant, moderate, reasonable country, and we're not seeing even the kind of the Reform Party, which some people analogize to the sort of radical right parties in Europe. So far, that is a much more reasonable, civilized party than the National Front in France or than AfD in Germany. And I think that reflects a deep, valuable thing about British people, that they dislike extremism, they dislike making enemies of people, and they dislike the sense that the world is facing apocalypse. I think that when you look at the US and the state of US politics, it feels very apocalyptic, and that, I think, is a very, very bad, worrying sign. And I think the fact that the UK has managed to avoid that so far is a great reflection on what's so good about Britain. And the thing that there is a point where problems get so bad that they generate their own solutions, because there's so much money on the table from fixing them, and because people are so fed up with them, and people who would have normally just sort of allowed the problem to persist, who are very talented but have their focus is elsewhere, just say, I'm fed up with this. And I have to say, I feel like that is happening in Britain right now. I think people who would have normally stayed out of politics or would have normally stayed away from these things are saying, no, this needs to get fixed. And if it's not going to be fixed by me, then it's not going to get fixed by anybody. And that makes me optimistic and hopeful.
Great. Thank you so much, Sam.
Thank you.